Chapter 2: The Family Myth of Ideology. Numerous treatises have been written about the perception of a historical real in the terms of a family narrative as a fundamental ideological operation, a story about the conflict of larger social forces, classes and so forth, is framed into the coordinates of a family drama. This ideology, of course, finds its clearest expression in Hollywood as the ultimate ideological machine. In a typical Hollywood product, everything, from the fate of the Knights of the Round Table, through the October Revolution, up to asteroids hitting Earth, is transposed into an Oedipal narrative. A Deleuzian cannot resist the temptation of pointing out how the main theoretical justification of such familialization is psychoanalysis, which makes it the key ideological machine. Capitalist realism. Our first step should be to analyze this family narrative at its most elementary, kitsch level. Exemplary here is Michael Crichton, today's successor of Arthur Haley, the first great author of capitalist realism, whose bestsellers back in the 1960s, Hotel, Airport, Cars, always focused on a particular site of production or complex organization, mixing a melodramatic plot with lengthy descriptions of the site's functions, in an unexpected echo of the Stalinist classics of the late 1920s and 30s, such as Gladkov's Cement. Crichton added to the genre a postmodern techno-thriller twist. In accordance with today's predominant politics of fear, he's the ultimate novelist of fear. Fear of the past, Jurassic Park, Eaters of the Dead; of the nanotechnological future, Prey; of Japan's economic strength, The Rising Sun; of sexual harassment, Disclosure; of robotic technology, Westworld; of the medical industry, Coma; of alien intrusions, Andromeda Strain; of ecological catastrophes, State of Fear. State of Fear, his most recent book, brings an unexpected final addition to this series of shadowy forces which lurk among us. Poised to wreak havoc, America's fiercest enemies are none other than the environmentalists themselves. As many a critic has noted, Crichton's books are not really novels. They are more like unfinished drafts, prospectuses for screenplays. However, it is this very feature which makes his work interesting for an analysis of contemporary ideology. The very lack of stylistic qualities, the totally transparent mode of writing, allows the underlying ideological fantasies to be staged at their embarrassingly sublimated purest, in naked form, as it were. Exemplary here is Prey, in which a nanotechnological experiment in a laboratory in the Nevada desert goes horribly wrong. A cloud of nanoparticles, millions of microrobots, escapes. The cloud, visible to observers as a black swarm, is self-sustaining, self-reproducing, intelligent, and it learns from experience, evolving hour by hour. Every effort to destroy it fails. It has been programmed to become a predator. Humans are its prey. Only a handful of scientists trapped in the laboratory can halt the release of this mechanical plague on a defenseless world. As is always the case in such stories, this big plot, the catastrophe that threatens to ruin humanity itself, is combined with the secondary plot, a set of relations and tensions amongst the group of scientists, with the troubled role reversal married couple at its center. Jack, the novel's narrator, was the manager of a cutting-edge computer program division in a media technology company before he was made a scapegoat for someone else's corruption and fired. Now he is a house husband, while his wife Julia is the workaholic vice president of Zymos, the nanotechnology company which owns the Nevada Desert Laboratory where the catastrophe occurs. Erotic, manipulative, and cold, she is a new version of the corporate vixen from Disclosure. At the novel's start, Jack has to cope with their 3 children, discusses Pampers versus Huggies with another father in the supermarket, and tries to control his suspicions that his wife is having an affair. Far from providing a mere human interest subplot, this family plot is what the novel really turns on. The cloud of nanoparticles should be conceived of as a materialization of the family's tensions. The first thing that cannot but strike the eye of anyone who knows Lacan is how this swarm resembles what Lacan, in his Seminar 11, called lamella. It appears indestructible in its infinite plasticity. It always reassembles itself, able to morph into a multitude of shapes. In it, pure evil animality overlaps with machine-like blind insistence. The lamella is an entity consisting of pure surface, without the density of a substance, an infinitely plastic object capable not just of incessantly changing its form, but even of transposing itself from one to another medium. Imagine something that is first heard as a shrill sound, and then pops up as a monstrously distorted body. A lamella is indivisible, indestructible, and immortal. More precisely, undead in the sense this term has in horror fiction. Not sublime spiritual immortality, but the obscene immortality of the living dead, which, after every annihilation, recompose themselves and clumsily carry on their activities. As Lacan puts it, the lamella does not exist. It insists. It is unreal, an entity of pure semblance, a multiplicity of appearances which seem to envelop a central void. Its status is purely phantasmatic. This blind, indestructible insistence of the libido is what Freud called the death drive, and one should bear in mind that the death drive is, paradoxically, the Freudian name for its very opposite, for the way immortality appears within psychoanalysis, for an uncanny excess of life, for an undead urge which persists beyond the biological cycle of life and death, of generation and corruption. Freud equates the death drive with the so-called compulsion to repeat, an uncanny urge to repeat painful past experiences which seem to outgrow the natural limitations of the organism affected by it, and to insist even beyond the organism's death. As such, the lamella is what is subtracted from the living being by virtue of the fact that it is subject to the cycle of sexed reproduction. It precedes sexual difference. It multiplies and reproduces itself by means of asexual self-division. In the novel's climactic scene, Jack holds Julia in his arms while she, unbeknownst to him, is already infected by the swarm and lives in symbiosis with the nanoparticles, receiving from them a superhuman life power. I held her. The skin of her face began to shiver, vibrating rapidly, and then her features seemed to grow, to swell as she screamed. I thought her eyes looked frightened. The swelling continued and began to break up into rivulets and streams. And then, in a sudden rush, Julia literally disintegrated before my eyes. The skin of her swollen face and body blew away from her in streams of particles, like sand blown off a sand dune. The particles curved away in the arc of the magnetic field towards the side of the room. I felt her body growing lighter and lighter in my arms. Still the particles continued to flow away with a kind of whooshing sound to all corners of the room. And when it was finished, what was left behind, what I still held in my arms, was a pale and cadaverous form. Julia's eyes were sunk deep in her cheeks. Her mouth was thin and cracked, her skin translucent. Her hair was colorless, brittle. Her collarbones protruded from her bony neck. She looked like she was dying of cancer. Her mouth worked. I heard faint words, hardly more than breathing. I leaned in, turned my ear to her mouth to hear. "Jack," she whispered. "It's eating me." This separation is then undone. The particles return to Julia and revitalize her. The particles on the wall were drifting free once more. Now they seemed to telescope back, returning to her face and body. And suddenly, in a whoosh, all the particles returned, and Julia was full and beautiful and strong as before, and she pushed me away from her with a contemptuous look. In the final confrontation, we then get both Julias side by side, the glimmering Julia composed of the swarm and the exhausted real Julia. Julia came swirling up through the air toward me, spiraling like a corkscrew, and grabbed the ladder alongside me. Except she wasn't Julia, she was the swarm, and for a moment the swarm was disorganized enough that I could see right through her in places. I could see the swirling particles that composed her. I looked down and saw the real Julia, deathly pale, standing and looking up at me, her face a skull. By now the swarm alongside me became solid-looking, as I had seen it become solid before. It looked like Julia. Here we are not talking about science, not even problematic science, but one of the fundamental fantasy scenarii, or more precisely, the scenario of the very disintegration of the link between fantasy and reality, so that we get the two of them, fantasy and reality, the Julia swarm and the real Julia, side by side, as in the wonderful scene from the beginning of Terry Gilliam's Brazil, where food is served in an expensive restaurant in such a way that we get on a plate itself a small patty-like cake, which looks and probably tastes like excrement, while above the plate hangs a color photo which shows us what we are really eating, namely a nicely cooked, juicy steak. This, then, is how one should read Prey. All the pseudo-scientific speculations about nanotechnology are here a pretext to tell the story of a husband reduced to a domestic role, frustrated by his ambitious corporate vixen of a wife. No wonder that, at the novel's end, a normal couple is recreated. At Jack's side is May, the passive but understanding Chinese colleague scientist, silent and faithful, lacking Julia's aggressiveness and ambition.